Kelly despised working the night shift on Halloween, but she loved her patients and took pride in her job. She made her rounds through the hospital, checking on all of her patients and making sure they were comfortable. She wished she could be home though, carving pumpkins and watching scary movies, but she was grateful to be able to help those who needed it most. Kelly made her way down the hospital corridor, stopping at each patient's room to check in on them. She was a great nurse but hid a lot of herself from her co-workers. She knew they resented her for this. You see, Kelly was also a gifted psychic and medium, but no one knew that as she did her best to hide it. This came in handy as she worked in the hospice ward of the hospital and treated people at the end of their lives. As she looked in on her first patient of the day, she seen a well-dressed man in the room holding Mr. Roberts' hand. As Kelly entered the room, she could tell that something was not right. Her patient, Mr. Roberts, was sitting in his chair with a visitor. Kelly didn't know who the man was, but she could tell that he was not human. He gave off the strongest presence of evil she had ever felt. This was no man, she just knew that this man was the devil. She thought she was seeing things, or maybe that the spirit of Halloween was getting to her. So she shoved the image out of her head and continued on with her rounds. Happily, she remembered who she would be seeing next. Mrs. Johnson was one of Kelly's favorite patients. She was always so kind and grateful for Kelly's visits. Mrs. Johnson's family never went to visit her, and for this reason Kelly always made it a point to stop in and spend time with her. As Kelly walked into Mrs. Johnson's room, he was there again. The devil was in her room sitting at the side of her bed comforting Mrs. Johnson. Kelly stopped in the doorway and listened in as the devil held Mrs. Johnson's hand in his. In exchange for her soul, the devil was offering Mrs. Johnson a little more time. Mrs. Johnson seemed just happy someone was paying attention to her and agreed. The devil looked over at Kelly, smiled, and vanished into thin air. Kelly quickly ran to Mrs. Johnson's side. Mrs. Johnson looked very different now. Her eyes were sunken in and she had dark circles around them. It is as if she had seen a ghost. "What happened, Mrs. Johnson?" Kelly asked, concerned. "Kelly, I have made a terrible mistake," Mrs. Johnson replied weakly. "I have seen hell and I really don't want to go back there." She begged with a desperation Kelly had never heard before. "Please, Kelly, please help me. Please don't make me go back there," Mrs. Johnson pleaded with her. Terrified, Kelly backed out of the room completely in shock. As she walked the halls, she could hear deals being made with each of her patients. All of them were making the same deal. For a little bit more time, her patients were giving up their souls. Kelly's psychic abilities were overwhelmed by a doomed sense of regret emanating out of every one of her patients' rooms. She knew that if she told anyone about what she had seen, they would think she was crazy. But she knew she had to do something. Kelly ran down to the admitting desk as the charge nurse was there. In a panicked state, Kelly began telling her co-workers what she had seen and felt. All of her co-workers began laughing at Kelly as she told them the story about the devil making a deal with each of her patients. One of them yelled out "Happy Halloween, Kelly," which caused another uproar of laughter. It was clear that they didn't believe her, but Kelly didn't care. She knew what she had seen and wasn't going to let anyone tell her otherwise, even if it meant being laughed at by her co-workers. Her boss, with the utmost care and concern, asked Kelly to take a seat. She ordered one of Kelly's co-workers to comfort her while she got her a glass of water. The charge nurse returned with 2 orderlies and they escorted Kelly to the psychiatric ward of the hospital. Kelly was quickly admitted. The doctors and nurses assessed her condition and decided that she needed to stay for observation. They were not sure what was wrong with her, but they wanted to help her in any way they could. All they knew was she was frantic and struggling with a mental health crisis. Kelly just laid strapped to her bed in a state of pain and suffering. She could still feel the agony her patients felt from the deals they had made with the devil. Her career was over as a nurse, which was something she loved doing. She was also tormented by the thoughts and feelings she was receiving from the patients in the psychiatric ward with her. At the lowest moment of her life, the devil appeared to Kelly as she lay crying in her hospital bed. He smiled at her and took her hand into his. Lucifer then apologized for putting her in this position, but explained to her that he really needed her for something in the future. He seemed very compassionate. He was charming and really not what she expected the devil to be. He then offered her a deal. In exchange for her soul, he would free the souls of all of the patients in her ward that he had just taken. He also promised to make everyone in her hospital forget about what happened that Halloween night. But he also wanted her to use her psychic abilities at his direction. Kelly laid in silence, not knowing what to do. Completely distraught, she could only question why this was all happening to her. A lot of nice people were about to go to hell who didn't deserve it. They only made those deals with the devil as they are all so close to dying. And most importantly, what did the devil want so badly from Kelly? Over and over she kept asking herself, "What should I do?